In the natural world and in life in general, threats may come from quite unexpected places. This seems to be especially common among the insects. There are quite a few insect tales that could rival the most gruesome horror stories that the human imagination has thus far been able to conjure up. Just one such story may be found among a family of flies known as the Asilidae. More commonly, these creatures are known as robber flies or assassin flies. Flies are a fairly common form of life, and some species are remarkably irritating pests at times. Indeed, if somebody were to speak of flies in general, it is likely the image of a small buzzing nuisance would immediately come to mind. Asilids are different. If you could imagine a fly reconfigured as a piece of high-end military hardware, you might have a fair sense of how these creatures look. The body is usually long and fairly thin, with large eyes and sturdy legs. They tend to be rather bristly as well, though this is not universal to all of the species. A closer look reveals large claws and gripping pads at the end of each leg, the same sorts of structures that allow houseflies to walk effortlessly along walls and ceilings are adapted here for the grasping of prey. The head is adorned with a thick tuft of bristles known as a mystax. Below this is a short, pointed proboscis, which adds to the menacing air of the creature. This collection of modified mouthparts is no mere decoration. It is a sort of biological stiletto adapted to pierce through insect exoskeletons. It is also quite capable of delivering a painful bite to an unwary human handler. These features combine to lend a sort of savage quality to the average robber fly. For larger species in particular, there is something almost prehistoric about their appearance. It is as if they were some brutish predecessor to the little scavenging flies of the modern era. There are over 7,000 species within this family, and every last one of them is predatory. The smallest are less than 3 millimeters long, while the largest approach 5 centimeters in length, a couple of inches. Not terribly large by human standards, but fairly monstrous for a fly. Certainly enough to unsettle a person if it were to suddenly land on them. As with most other flies, the larval stage of a typical asilid is a pale, legless maggot. Relatively little is known about the larval habits of this family. Most seem to live in places like soil or decaying wood, and by some accounts they are predators like the adults. However, this is as yet unproven for most species, and it is entirely possible that many of these larvae exist as scavengers or generalist feeders of one sort or another. The pupal stage resembles that of more primitive flies like craneflies or mosquitoes, rather than the largely featureless puparia seen in houseflies and their immediate relatives. There is no outer cocoon, and pupation seems to occur most often in soil or leaf litter. Likely, with so many different species, the finer details are considerably more varied overall. In contrast to their larval and pupal stages, the adult asilids are relatively well documented. This is to be expected as they live their lives out in the open rather than being hidden away. Indeed, most of the asilids are quite bold in their habits. These creatures don't dart about aimlessly, landing on random people. Instead, their behavior is far more deliberate and oddly calculating at times. When a robber fly hunts, it typically uses a sort of ambush technique. It will land on a suitable perch that gives it a good view of its surroundings and wait. When suitable prey flies close enough, the fly launches itself into the air and intercepts the unfortunate creature. The wings are relatively narrow, allowing for considerable speed and maneuverability. The legs, with their claws and adhesive pads, are generally capable of holding on to prey long enough for the fly to deliver a lethal bite. Of course, not every potential meal will give up without a fight, but this is of little concern to the robber fly. These hunters appear to be entirely unbothered by any noxious chemical defenses that might persuade other predators to withdraw. More mechanical assaults are similarly useless. The legs are quite sturdy and armored enough to be fairly difficult to damage. They are also strong enough to keep the prey well away from the body. Of course, the head does need to be brought in to deliver the bite, but here the asilids have a unique sort of protection as well. The mystax, that cluster of sturdy bristles on the face, serves to shield the head from attack as the mouthparts go to work. The proboscis usually finds its way to a suitable weak point in the prey's exoskeleton, maybe a seam between a couple of plates or perhaps a soft underbelly, maybe even an eye. Regardless of the precise point of attack, the mouthparts find their way past the outer shell and deliver a deadly mixture of paralytic neurotoxins and proteases. The former substances quickly render the prey quite helpless and incapable of movement, while the latter slowly liquefy its internal organs. As this dissolution takes a bit of time, a robber fly usually returns to its favored perch with its prey securely held in its grasp. It will slowly siphon away the creature's insides as a grisly sort of cold soup before eventually discarding the empty husk. This overall pattern of predation appears to be extremely successful, at least in the insect world. Asilids are found on every continent apart from Antarctica. They have a virtually cosmopolitan distribution with thousands of described species. This is impressive enough by itself, but remember they are also predators. Going even one level up the food chain usually limits population size and overall biodiversity at least a little. After all, food is much easier to come by for herbivores, scavengers, and generalists. Food that does inconvenient little things like run away or fight back is a bit more tricky to deal with. Even so, the robber flies seem to do quite well. Some species are known to take prey several times larger than themselves. Depending on the exact species of robber fly, virtually no local arthropod is safe. Heavily armored beetles, agile hoverflies, even damselflies and dragonflies, which are accomplished predators themselves. Some asilids will happily feed on spiders, which is a strange reversal of roles. It is usually the spider that snares and consumes the fly, after all. Still, perhaps the most extreme quarry for some robber flies is the sort of insect that even humans know to leave well enough alone most of the time. A type of insect that can attack in the hundreds or even the thousands, wielding venomous stings in defense of their homes. I speak of the bees and the wasps. For most creatures, a bee or a wasp is something to leave well alone and allow to go quietly about its business. For the right sort of robber fly, it's just another meal. This sort of creature that will fly up and tackle an angry wasp out of midair before draining it dry, that has to be the insect's answer to something like a wendigo or a skinwalker. Actually, a skinwalker might not be a bad comparison in some cases at least. Those familiar with the hopefully mythical creatures know that in some of the more modern creepypastas, a skinwalker will often hunt by impersonating a person, something that looks human or almost human with just a bit of the uncanny valley about it. Certain asilids, particularly within the genus Laphria, bear an uncanny resemblance to bumblebees. They have the stout, fuzzy bodies with the black and yellow markings, and yet there is something a bit off about them. A close look shows the antennae are all wrong, the eyes as well for that matter, and the pointed proboscis protruding from the face is distinctly menacing. It isn't altogether certain whether these creatures mimic bees in order to deceive their prey, or simply to persuade larger creatures to leave them alone. Either way, the sight of a bee being slowly drained and devoured by something that looks almost like a bee is rather chilling in its way. Rather than simply leave things on such a grisly scene, I would like to end on a more amusing note. The asilids are, on the whole, remarkably bold and brutish sorts of creatures. They are aggressive, and calling them proactive would be something of an understatement. This can be well illustrated by the species Blepharotes coriatus, native to Australia. It is one of the largest known asilids and is commonly called the giant yellow robber fly. Through the summer months, it takes its toll on the local populations of bees, wasps, beetles, and airborne ants. Like many predators, these flies are territorial with hunting ranges. In the case of this particular species, each male's territory tends to be centered around a dead tree. I'm not certain of the accuracy of what follows, but it is amusing enough to be worth relating, even if it isn't necessarily altogether true. If any other robber fly of the same species approaches a territory, the resident male will immediately attempt to mate with it. He will make this attempt whether the intruder is a female or another male. The former outcome tends to result in another generation of giant yellow robber flies. The latter outcome tends to result in the trespassing male leaving the area as quickly as his wings will carry him. One can almost imagine a little yard sign out in front of the dead tree reading something like "Trespassers will be mated with," though I suspect a more direct and vulgar term would be used instead. If nothing else, I think such a yard would have very few trespassers. Overall, the Asilids are a wonderful example of exceptions to the rule. They are some of the most effective solitary predators among the insects and a genuine nightmare for pretty much anything within their weight class. Not bad for the cousins of common filth flies.